Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa Catholic Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. We are so happy to be here with you. My name is Bo Bonner. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing here at Mercy College. But I see you in the same hallway, so I have a guess that you work in a similar place.
Yes, at Mercy College of Health Sciences, I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I tried to say my name in the intro, like sort of in an Eeyore voice. It's kind of weird to do radio during Lent because when you get on the radio, when you're on air, you're supposed to bring the energy, you know?
That's right.
But it's also Lent, so I didn't know. I was like, I'm Bud Marr.
Well, for me, if I am fasting and don't get enough food, I sort of hallucinate. So it might seem like I have more energy than I usually do. I was liking the idea that we work at the same college, but when we walk by, we don't make eye contact, and people don't realize we have this show together. That's, of course, untrue. I'm glad not only that I get to see you all the time through the hallways, but also I'm thankful for Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. Thank you for making the Uncommon Good possible so that all the good listeners out there, whether they're listening over the Iowa Catholic airwaves, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or anytime, anywhere on podcast, Mercy College of Health Sciences makes that possible, but I hope it makes many things possible, maybe in your role as the general, like we talked about last time.
That's right.
You can talk about some of the things it makes possible for our students.
Yeah, if you are interested in what the college is doing, one event that I would highlight is upcoming in April 8th from 1 to 4 p.m. We are hosting our annual research symposium on campus. So the topic for this year is immigrant and refugee journeys, specifically having to do with the healthcare concerns of those communities. We all know the Gospels really highlight the importance of serving the least of these, the strangers in our midst. And so this will be a great conversation, I think, April 8th, 1 to 4 p.m.
It's great to be able to have people within the community and outside of it, really, Bud, come and be a part of what's going on at Mercy College of Health Sciences. I do hope our students get to be part of that interaction. It's easy to get caught up in the very difficult work. I want to throw that out. Not difficult as impossible, but it really is a lot of work to figure out how to take care of human bodies. I got a close-up of this just talking about one neat gizmo, piece of technology that I got to see. I'm going to mess up the name, but it's a anatomage table. Have you seen this yet?
Yeah, I love saying that word, but I think I still butcher it. And
Anatomage.
So it's based on anatomy. Anatomage. I think that's right.
So, folks, if you're going to Mercy College and you're going to be taking various anatomy classes, they have this amazing computer thing where basically you see a whole human cadaver on the screen, and you can basically slice it up, remove levels. You can see the human body moving with just the skeletons and the muscles. It is, you've heard many of our shows where we're very cautious about technology and what it does to education, but I just have to geek out on this one. It is amazing, and I feel like just seeing one demonstration, I sort of understand muscles better now. So that's just one thing that we're able to do where we're hopefully combining, like we say in our mission, a liberal arts education with health sciences instruction.
Well, what's cool about my role is I kind of bridge those worlds between the professional practice and the liberal arts and sciences. So I work directly with our professors who teach the math, the science, the philosophy, and hopefully, like you're saying, that gives students that foundation that they need to be great nurses, sonographers, physical therapist assistants, whatever it happens to be.
So once more, thanks, Mercy College, for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. Bud, hopefully have a good show today. It is Lent. We were talking about fasting already. Are you ready to be disciplined like you've never been before, Bud?
I'm ready as like
that
sort of
sound confident.
I know, because I want to be confident. I do know my own shortcomings and weaknesses, but I am ready to commit to it and to cooperate with grace insofar as God strengthens me on this journey.
And that's what we want to talk about today. It's going to talk about Ash Wednesday, Lent, but this idea of submission, the willing submission of the will, we're going to talk about that today. Hopefully not make it sound as confusing like I just did, but that's going to be the topic for today. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, I think I'm going to start out with something we threw out last show. Towards the end of the show, we were throwing out that in order to offer up yourself as sacrifice, so we said it's important to understand that for Christianity, we must possess ourselves first in order to then make an oblation or a sacrifice of ourselves. This is going to be really big with Ash Wednesday just happening, the rest of Lent, where, Bud, there's this idea that we have to confess, right? Repentance is not, it's an act of humility and humiliation, right? We have to be humble. We even have to be willing to let people know what our sin is so that we can repair it, do something about it. But what it's not is, I don't even know what the right word, it's not self-denying like we think. It's a sort of paradox of Christianity that when I choose to put on a practice of denial, of penance, I'm actually not being self-denying, or I'm not being self-diminishing. How about that, Bud?
Yeah.
I have to claim I am the person who did these things, and I am the person who wants to change. Then I can pour myself out into others, into the confession, into the penance, and I can let that grace of God penetrate and renew this spirit that I've opened up, as Psalm 50 seems to say. I think that's what we want to talk about here, Bud, is that to go into Lent, maybe part of this is to say clearing up misunderstandings about how penance works and what that means about things like self-esteem. But I also think that it is sort of elemental when we talk about Catholic social teaching and just the idea about what we think it is Christians do in the public world when they're being paramount Christians. Because it's certainly the case that some people act like Christianity is just a death cult that's only worried in sort of perversely making people hate themselves and sort of cower, before the will of others. Other people will act like we're pie in the sky people that, let the world go to pot because we have silly notions about our, we'll even be called like a purity cult where we act like we don't have to dirty our hands with the world. All of this gets down to maybe misunderstandings about why we would do penance in the first place, what confession is. But I think that gets down to this idea of the will and how sacrifice demands a certain self-possession, Bud, before we could ever actually sacrifice ourselves.
Yeah, this has always been a fascinating part of Christian ethics for me. When you think about, when you contemplate God and God's essence, and just that he's the all-powerful creator of everything, you expect from a natural perspective, without the eyes of faith, without the gift of revelation, that God would be coercive in his relationship to human beings. So here's the law, here's the command, you do it or else. What you see in Scripture is something much more nuanced and textured. I think all the way back to like Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with this angel, and it's really the angel's kind of a manifestation of the Lord's presence. And they struggle throughout the night. Now at the end, Jacob begs this mysterious figure for a blessing and says, I won't let you go until I'm blessed. The figure then does bless him, but wounds his hip, and so Jacob limps the rest of his life. But that's the foundational narrative of the creation of the nation of Israel. That's where Jacob's given the name Israel, which means roughly like the one who struggles. And I bring up that story because even when God calls his special people, you see that it's an encounter that involves like this dynamic interplay. And then as salvation history carries on, there is judgment that comes upon the people of God, but God calls them to take on this specific identity. And then really with Jesus Christ, there's a tension here because the teachings of Jesus Christ are sort of like harsh and demanding on one level. It's sort of like the highest level of ethical teaching that maybe human beings have ever received or heard. But on the other hand, it's also a call, like Christ says, come and follow me. He lets some people, like the rich young ruler, walk away sad. He tells his disciples when they share this message with others, if they're rejected in a town, like shake the dust off your sandals and go to the next town. And so there's this dynamic interplay. And I think it relates to what you're saying about the Wilbo. It's interesting that the church calls us to fast. It calls us to give alms. But especially at this point in history, the coercive measures, we were talking about this before the show started. It's like the church tries to persuade us to take on this yoke. And the yoke at one angle is very like excessive and harsh, but on another, Christ himself says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And so the church really believes and teaches that those who enter into this way of life, they'll achieve a kind of freedom. And I'll even use the word like lightness about their life that's impossible apart from like following your own way.
No, I think that's a wonderful way to put it. It's getting at the heart of what I think we have to struggle with to enter into Lent. So one thing that I like that you pointed out to sort of explore a little bit more, I think sometimes people go, well, clearly God is a big bully, or if he's not a big bully, even if they're for this sort of vision of God, he's the guy with all the power in the room. He's the king. He has the scepter. So even though it might seem like coercion, is it not the case that God said, do X, Y, and Z, and when we didn't, he's like, well, now you have to die. And so our dying is the clearest mark that God uses coercion against us. What's interesting is there's a complete different way to read this. I don't know if I was telling you, and if it is, let me know, because someone was telling me there's either Midrash or there's church fathers that point this out, that one very long-standing interpretation of death being announced as what happens after the disobedience in the garden is that it's merciful, which is to say that if we could have gone on sinning indefinitely with no change necessary, with no end of our life made possible as the delineation of our evil, this goes to everything that St. Paul and even Socrates argues, that the worst punishment for wickedness is to be kept in your wickedness, and that undying wickedness, with no possibility of it terminating and stopping, is the worst thing possible. Indeed, there's a way in which, of course, the devils have a much worse punishment because they don't have this sort of death, right, that like looms over them. They've already sort of made their internal fixed will towards evil. Death in this regard is merciful. It's bad, right? And we're going to do away with it, and it's the last, thing that Christ will put under his feet. But it's also a good or a mercy insofar as it doesn't let evil go on indeterminately and us to stay fixed in that pattern. Some people will say, well, this is just you reaching for it or trying to make, what is the old Oklahoma saying? A purse out of a pig's ear. You look surprised, but just trust me on this one. The idea, right, that you're trying to make something look shinier and nicer than it really is.
Yeah. But
I think that it gets to the heart of the matter about why we would think that there's sort of coercive measures to be had at all. It's easy for us to think like with a parent, at some point you're going to have to yell, nay, even grab, nay, even tackle your kid if they're running towards a street with a lot of oncoming traffic. So people go like, oh, okay, so God sends punishments or whatever, that's fine. But what about this death business, right? Can we say that death is really the tackling of a child before they run into the street? And if you don't believe in sort of the possibility that you could endlessly sin without remainder, without a stopping point, and that death is not a terminus that makes us recall why life is important and what we have to do in the here and now, I suppose you can think that it's just an excuse, but I think Ash Wednesday is not a matter of, I'm putting these ashes on your head to remind you you've been a naughty boy and a naughty girl, and God's mad at you. It's to say, you weren't here, you're a creature, and creatures go back into the ground. And that delineation point is what not only gives meaning and purpose to our life, as if God's like a motivational speaker with death, it is this field of time to say, what are we going to do about this brokenness in us and the hope for change?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it from that angle before, but with what you're saying about death being a kind of mercy, if Adam and Eve, if their natural lives, physical lives would have continued forward after sinning, they would have been sort of vampires. I mean,
right. We invent these, like undead things scare us. Undead things that do evil are the monsters we make up.
Prelapsarian, like before sin, if they had continued to cooperate with the grace that God had extended to them, they would have entered the beatific vision, and so would have entered into eternity. And eternity, of course, for us involves this kind of union with God that we can't fully understand. But just to have life persistently while sinning and all the, rough edges that come with life, that would have been pretty horrific. I think as you were talking, all of the so-called like curses that are pronounced after Adam and Eve's sin, there's a hidden blessing built into them. And what I have in mind, so when you think about when God says to Adam, like, now because of sin, you're going to have to earn your food by the sweat of your brow. Beforehand, all that was needed for sustenance was provided in the garden. Now life will be toilsome and wearying in a lot of ways. Or with Eve, like, your desire will be for your husband. You'll experience this pain in childbirth. In all of those cases, one of the most important parts of life. So in the first, our careers, basically. The second, our relationships. And the third, giving birth to children. I think those are three things that are good in and of themselves, but we're prone to making them idols. So I'm unhappy. I'm separated from God. There's this chasm that I experience in my life. Maybe my job will be the one thing that gives life meaning. Mm-hmm. Or if I can have this romantic relationship with the person I have a crush on, that sounds kind of silly, but like, or when the first time you give birth to, like, you see your new child, your firstborn, it is awe-inspiring. It kind of blows you away. And so human beings, like in those areas where we would have been prone to saying, like, this is really truly the end of life, God reminds us, no, we have some greater transcendent end.
No, I think that's a fantastic way to put that, is the mark of coercion, which is a word we all hate and we're all worried about. When you think about what after sin, after we've shown the predilection of following our own will, that even the best things like sustenance, relationship, progeny, all these things like this, then unless we can fathom or understand that they will be work and that they will be difficult and involve struggle and sadness, no, I think that's a fascinating point. And this is precisely of the stuff of Lent. Lent is not about giving up, if you're waiting till Lent to give up, like, well, I'm giving up murder for Lent, bud. But if you see me about to murder one person, you tell me to stop and wait for June. No, you should never murder people. Lent is about giving up what's good, but gets in the way of the love of God. Yeah. And so, man, but that's one way to put, like, to rephrase what you just said. There is a Lent-like nature to getting food, having relationships, progeny, the next generation. And the Lent sort of thing, the tinge of difficulty is to say, of course, these things can't be your idols. These are not only fantastic things, they're basically the most important things in life. But if you make them idols, you will not only be disappointed, but you will disappoint those things as well, because you must turn to God first before you receive these gifts back in their fullness.
So what the church does, and this is a great grace, is it asks us to anticipate those, like we've been throwing around like coercive measures, but I see it more as like notches down that God, let me put it this way.
Throttling back.
The difficulties that come with the most important parts of life, in some ways, the penance that we perform in Lent and throughout our Catholic life is kind of anticipating that. So life will inevitably come with suffering. And I know we live in a culture that's suffering denying and also death denying. There are celebrities out there who, through plastic surgery, I hear some of them sleep in, like, I don't know the right word, like oxygen enhanced chambers.
Yes.
The way that we think about buying cars,
or you don't. No, I'm joking.
Or even drinking alcohol or whatever. Like, there's a way where our culture, like so much of the marketing and the momentum behind it, is built around how do I preserve my youth for as long as possible, or even perpetually. We read science fiction novels about this, or we hear stories about crazy things that very wealthy people are trying to pull off, right? And the church says, no, part of life is suffering, and the end of life, not the purpose of life, but the end point of our natural lives is death. And it's actually a curse and sort of a prefiguration of hell to deny those things. And so when on Ash Wednesday, when we approach the priest and he marks our heads with the ashes and says, from dust you were created, to dust you shall return, and gives us that reminder, that's a blessing if we hear it rightly.
Well, it's interesting, too, that they'll also go to great lengths of suffering to deny suffering. They will kill themselves trying not to die. And I only mean that partially poetically. Plastic surgery is an interesting one. That is some serious, just grotesque, sawing on a person's face to make it look like they haven't aged.
I've seen some workouts that veer very close to like intense forms of penance.
Absolutely. And I mean, even though you were talking about like isobaric chambers, I think that's what you were going at with the oxygen tent sleeping. I got to say that the sort of routines that people will do. So, let's even like spread this in a social way. We will cause immense suffering outside of our borders to make sure that we don't, quote unquote, seem to suffer in ours. All the while, suicide rates are going up because of the emptiness of these lives, et cetera, et cetera. We create tons of suffering in other areas to act like we don't suffer in this life. Lent, and how it's prefigured, how it's sort of sewn in at the very beginning here in the Garden of Eden, Lent is asking us to choose particular type of suffering, a particular type of coercion, grown in the garden, as it were, of the church's practice throughout the ages, to say giving up these sort of things, taking on these sort of things, giving alms, praying, fasting from these foods, it's actually the small, maybe this is what like Christ means by the easy yoke. If you do these things, it actually creates, like you said, the capacity, the possibility of joy in places where exactly the rest of the world has it flipped. They'll inflict suffering over here to make a false joy. The church goes, following the seasons, what if we do these small acts of allowing our will to be coerced? We'll talk about what that means in the next segment. But giving ourselves over so that we create that space where that real joy can come about. And I'm hoping that that might be a way to clarify, maybe like for people to ruminate, what it means to choose a penance during Lent, how we move forward in that regard, and it not being seen merely as punishment. It clearly is. Like if we hadn't sinned, if we don't have original sin, there won't be these punishments. But this is sort of like the strange joy of Lent, where we learn to appoint our penance, with beauty. It's like a jewel encrusted penance. That's why I know people are always arguing, like, do we do fish fries up too much or not? And I understand the question, but I think that's always been our impulse, but is to see the penance of the church not simply as drudgery, but as this real potential to submit to something for the sake of a freedom we don't have otherwise.
Yeah, I know we're coming up against the break here shortly. I think in the second half of the show, or this next segment, it'd be interesting to talk about the wisdom behind the specificity that the church gives with these penances. And so you kind of hinted at this with the fish fries, but we obviously have Catholics sometimes who say, like, why is giving up fish? Why is giving up meat, flesh meat on Fridays, like, why that, sort of thing. And then people dig into history and they try to come up with theories as to how this started.
Yeah. The Pope was making money off the fish industry.
But I want to, as a sneak preview, I want to touch on, like, there's a writer, an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, who's talked about this. Mm-hmm. And I hope we can unpack in this second segment the real wisdom behind the church saying, do this specific thing, how it's operated in the past. So I think recovering it now could be a great blessing to Catholics as well.
But if you ever want to derail a show, always bring up Mary Douglas. I am always willing to talk about her. She is fantastic. Everybody should take a chance to read her more often. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are talking about, Lent in some ways, but maybe the way in which Lent is threaded throughout everything we do. We're talking about the submission of the will, which clearly has everything to do with Ash Wednesday, Lenten practice. But we're also talking about how it really undergirds everything that not only Catholic social teaching, but the Catholic frame of mind about the human life and the will is really foundational in getting this right. So, Bud, you were already threatening me with a good time by talking about Mary Douglas. So we'll get to that, but I think by way of that, this is what I wanted to, where a lot of this idea came from. I've been teaching the Republic again. It is always great to teach Plato's Republic. This is not something he exactly says, but if anybody who's read Book 2 of the Republic knows where I'm coming from with this. They ask Socrates, are you trying to persuade us, or are you just trying to seem like you're persuading us? And then it's off to the races. But really, when you get down to this about why does anybody follow a law, a person, a practice? So why do you follow speed limit signs to why do you submit when the church says don't eat meat on Fridays during Lent? Why, if the church said you're excommunicated, would you listen to it? You know, if they excommunicate you, you go like, well, I'm never going to listen to you guys again. There's this question about why do people follow authority? Mm-hmm. And seemingly there's two ways, but then I'm going to throw out there's a third. The first, of course, is violence, right? This is what we're talking about with coercion. Whether that's great, huge, literal threats of death, right? Like you must do this or I'll kill you, I'll hurt you, I'll maim you. Whether this is we'll shun you from the community, we'll make fun of you. There will be some penalty that I will enforce by the fact that I have some power over you that you don't have. One way to make someone listen to authority is by sheer coercion. Now, in the worst instances, Bud, that is violence, crime, all these things like this. But if you think about this, if it comes down to like the very basic sort of social relationship we think about this is I'm a parent, children are small. And I don't mean this even in the abusive way, just if the kid is like, I'm going to run into the I-35. And you go, no, Jimmy, you can't. Here's the reasons why. And Jimmy's like, la, 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 I-35, I go, and starts running. I can coerce little Jimmy because I am just bigger than Jimmy, and I can hold Jimmy until we walk away from I-35. See my point, right? Yeah. So at its worst, right, it's violent and coercive and criminal and against human dignity. But at the very basis, right, there are people who can make someone else not do something, and that we even understand that, right, when adults can literally pick up their kid and get them out of a dangerous situation. On the other hand, we can persuade or convince. I can convince you of my authority. I can do this through charisma. I can do this through argument. I can do it sometimes by appeals to authority or the past. Maybe some people would say, and this is where like Socrates gets into this, there's some of those sophistry, right, fake arguments that are actually coercion and manipulation that pretend to be persuasion. But mostly we know what we mean when we say, I've been persuaded to follow your authority. What's interesting with the church, and especially as we're here in Lent, but I would argue that it's this way with more than we're realizing, the church persuades you to allow it to coerce you. And you go, no, I willingly, don't eat meat on Friday. And I'm like, well, maybe you do. You get used to it. Hey, you like fish. It's fun. But actually, right, there's all sorts of ways in which what the church does is it tries to persuade you when it's converting you. And I know this because I'm a convert. I'm going to convert you. And what you're going to do is say, I submit myself to all that the Catholic Church teaches and commands. I forget what I said all those years ago. But it asks, like, are you going to submit your will to the coercion of the church? And I and you and everyone who's converted, and in their own way, right, everybody who's been confirmed says yes. So this is an interesting dynamic sometimes, Bud, that I think people don't quite act. Like they'll sort of go back and forth between, oh, you're being coercive now, but you were persuading me beforehand. But there's a lot of law and rules that you have to be persuaded to submit to the coercive authority of the person who doesn't, or otherwise they have no authority with you. If you are I'm in the church as long as I agree with it, and the minute I don't, I'll leave. Well, that's not what the church has in mind when it talks about docility and things like this. Are we serious? I mean, the coaches are like this too, right? Like you join a team and you're like, I'm going to run laps when the coach says I did something wrong. If every time the coach says you did something wrong, you have to go run laps and you're like, I quit the team, you were never in it to be in the team. So this is not just Catholics, but I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about this during Lent.
Yeah, I think that our history here in this country and even our experience today has impacted the way that we look at authority. So even when you mention coercive authority, a lot of times in life, it's a great thing. So for instance, the child like careening towards the busy street, for a parent or someone else to like grab them and say like, no, you're not doing this, and to enforce that just through coercion, like that saves the child's life. A lot of times in our own lives, like we think when we get to adulthood that we see reality like completely clearly. We need this sort of thing. So even something like speed limit laws, which we sort of like in our minds tend to think of as arbitrary, like it's a good thing that they're there, and they're actually, I think, subtly or over time like reinforcing something important about how we drive, right? I don't mean to like wax too philosophical about speed limit laws today, but there's this breakdown, I think, in our view, in that there is in our time, and I don't have to go through like listing which ones, there are laws on the books that are out of sync with natural and divine law. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, even good Christians, like even persons like myself and friends that I have, we sort of buck against authority, and so again, here in the United States, I think politically we kind of have this notion like, well, a person doesn't really rightly have authority over me unless I've granted that to them. Right. Throughout most of history, like sacred scripture, even like Christendom, that's not the way that it was thought about. Now, like we can use democracy like functionally to achieve certain ends and things like that. But we have to be careful, I think. I hope I'm not getting too far afield. But I think because we have lamentable authority figures in our lives or laws that are out of sync with God's law, we can be fast and loose with authority. Now, none of us are truly anarchists. No. Or even, we don't have to get into libertarianism today. It's got some gaps in its worldview as well. But we sort of take for granted that structure that is in place, and we sort of act like, well, you know, if we just left our own devices, things would mostly go fine.
Right. And I don't know, do we not have any friends that could make a road?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking, like, do you trust any of our friends to make a road?
I think we have to trust our government for that much.
I'm wondering if we're offending anyone that we personally know who's like, I could make a road, Bo. But I could not make a road. But it's easy to forget. I mean, we've talked about this before in a show, too, that anybody who, like, uses flushing toilets and is like, yep, it's going to go into a sewer, it's easy to say, like, see, we don't need any coercion. We don't need any structure. And you're like, I don't know, man. It smells really good in my house because of those sort of things. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, so that's about what I had. Okay. That, the roads and the toilets are foundational, but what you're saying is like we sort of take these things for granted. It's the water that we swim in, not the toilet water, but it's an important reminder during this Lent.
I'm sorry, our show is great. That's a great show. Not the toilet water.
If I could say something more, I'll go a different direction with it. Okay. So this kind of relates to over the last half century, I think in the Catholic Church, I'm painting with broad strokes here, we've had a movement driven by a good impulse to throw off legalism. Now, this term legalism, it has different meanings. Like St. Paul uses it in a very specific way in his letters. But legalism, in a shorthand, is saying, like, if I take care of these external checklists, then I'm right with God. So, for instance, as a Catholic, like, I'm baptized, I'm confirmed, I go to Mass each Sunday, I don't eat meat on Fridays, et cetera, I'm good to go. And there are theologians and pastors who, I think especially like mid-20th century, they saw this kind of culture in place, and they were like, look, there's a way in which we've turned the external sort of like markers into kind of this hypocrisy, a sort of checklist that doesn't get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, as someone who likes the Baltimore Catechism, a hyper Baltimore Catechism. Yeah.
And so in response to that, there were those who, like, for instance, with fasting on Fridays, or with, I should say, abstinence on Fridays, there was this impulse or this like movement to say, rather than saying, let's do this specific thing, like not eat meat, we'll open the door to the Catholic, like the faithful choosing a penance that's appropriate to their lives. And this will make it more sort of like spiritually meaningful. I'm sure many listeners have heard this sort of thing. When I mentioned Mary Douglas during the first segment, she, in the wake of this movement, went back to saying, like, well, was something lost when the specificity of the church's laws were sort of softened? And she makes some great points about, as human beings, like she really gets down to human nature. It's funny because in many ways we need that specificity. So, and this kind of like the good impulse was to say, like, let's choose a penance that's meaningful and that suits sort of the shape of my life. what ended up happening is that for a lot of Catholics, for a lot of Christians, like Fridays just became sort of laissez-faire. And you ask folks today, like, well, are we supposed to abstain from meat year-round? And it's kind of unclear. Like canon law, and really it turns it over to the bishops of the United States or the bishops in different parts of the world. And here in the U.S., like there's more openness outside of Lent. But we've kind of lost what Mary Douglas calls like the hooks upon which we hang our culture. Mm-hmm. We're like, pre this change, Catholics were known as fish eaters, and that was used as a pejorative terms, but it gave us this kind of identity. And then that served as a light bulb moment for many of the faithful where it's like, well, I'm abstaining. And it was painful in a way. Like if you've ever tried to like make this practice regular, you find like on a lot of Fridays, you'll be reaching for that Big Mac or whatever. And you're reminded, oh, the church has asked me to make this small sacrifice. And then like your synapses start to connect together and draw sort of like the theological conclusions from that practice.
The Big Mac theological connections. Well, you know what's interesting about this is I've seen someone argue this with me, bud. They forwarded me an article or an email, and it was the Friday fast and abstinence practice, circa 1958 or whatever it was. And so you have the main one, which is don't eat meat. And I think it was actually like it was like so it's like, here it is. And then there was what preceded it was something, and it was long. It was like 55 exceptions or something like this. And they're like, this is what you want? And I had to be like, well, yeah, this is great. This goes back to sort of the adorning our penance with praise that happens with Lenten fish fries. I think there's something really uniquely correct, if not squirrely, about the idea of like, we're going to abide by the rules, but we're going to abide by the rules in style. Like, that's a very Catholic thing. And so we're going to only eat fish, but we're going to make a big deal of it. We're going to raise money, and it's going to be this weird sort of cultural event. Does it miss some things that like monastic fasting in a monastery does? Yes, which is why we should have monasteries in a variety of ways that people do this. I understand where people says this missed the point, but I think there's something to the fact of if you care enough about something that you'll also that's how the 52 exceptions came about. What if I'm diabetic? What if I'm pregnant? What if I'm working in a field? And you go, yeah, like if people care enough to be that annoying about it, and Rome has to go like, fine, 52 exceptions. But I got to say that I think there's something to that. And it gets back to this will thing. So what I mean by that is, so someone goes, look, Buster, speaking to Rome, you persuaded me to fall under the coercion of your laws, and I'm going to, but I want to know exactly what that coercion entails. And so, yes, it can be abused. I'm not going to act like it didn't lead to they call it Pelagianism. I don't know if that's even fair, but you get the point that I'm getting at. But precisely the idea to say, okay, we're going to submit, and now we're going to ask the sort of annoying questions that might lead to 52 exceptions. But I think that that's a spirit, like you said, that's a very human nature. I think about this. We've said this before on a show, too, where everybody thinks of the Old Testament as the big, mean, merciless part of religion. And then in the New Testament, everything's like sort of opened up. But there's another way you can totally flip that. New Testament, man, like you said, it's hard. It's like the law must be on the flesh of your heart, right? Like you have to be all things to all people, as Paul says. In the Old Testament, it's like, here's the list of things to do. Should we do this? And you're like, it's a pillar of flame, guys. Like we should probably follow it. So there's a way in which, what's more merciful, what's easier, what's the easy yoke. I think that we miss the forest for the trees sometimes when we say open it up, because you're right. Like most of us are not good about submitting our will, except for there is coercion about it. So but I know that this is the case because people who are offered like free workouts, what's the joke? They never come back. Yeah. But if what's the whole point of shelling out like $100 to go or whatever it is to a gym? It's like, oh man, I better make this money worth it. So why wouldn't the like you said, the long practice wisdom of the church understand that? And I think that gets to like why meat? Because sometimes people go like, why is meat the big deal? I'm interested to see the angle that you're taking, but for me, it gets into this like, hey, the church must know something. We've done it for so long. There's something essential about it. So maybe we should listen to that long-standing wisdom.
Well, when we're on the show, I feel like a lot of times we have to give qualifications, and we're not trying to be squirrely, but of course there's a individualization to this sort of conversation where we mentioned on the show before some Catholics who struggle with scrupulosity. Mm-hmm. You know, like the pastoral care for them will be different when talking about Lent, but the abuse of something doesn't undermine its use. And when you talk about Catholics who, like I have in mind, you know, someone's like, well, Uncle Patrick, like he always like he would do these acrobatics to sort of like get around the Lenten fast. And I think it's kind of impressive that the church, like you're saying, sort of persuades this coerciveness where even someone who's like sort of like only goes halfway, they're still thinking like, well, how do I fulfill the letter?
Yeah.
But still have some fun with it?
Well, I mean, like, so James Joyce and whichever one he has it, where like the old men in Ireland would sit outside and smoke during Mass, but they would touch the outside wall of the church. And I'm like, you know, that's missing the point, but it's also getting the point in a way. And like you said with scrupulosity too, I think people go like, if you have these rules and there's 52 exceptions, that'll drive scrupulous people crazy. I'm like, I don't know. Actually, the worst thing that I've ever, like, if you're talking about scrupulous people I know, the worst penances they were given were open-ended ones.
Oh, yeah.
Because then they would go Martin Luther on it. Like, actually having distinct rules is one of the first things that they tell you in the spiritual care of scrupulous people. Get a priest that goes, okay, you do these 3 things and you're done. Don't do anything else. So it's actually, I think, sometimes counterintuitive in that regard.
I think you're smart to mention also the wisdom of the church, like the long-standing wisdom, where we talk about this with our students, but sometimes there are habits and customs in human life, and we think they're completely silly or sort of like arbitrary, and then as we practice them, we find there's some real wisdom there. So, for instance, one that we bring up in our bioethics course is like, don't step on a grave. What word am I looking for?
Yeah,
like a grave marker, or as you're walking through the cemetery, like don't just walk roughshod over all the graves. That internalized something important about how we treat the dead for young people. That if you tried to give them this like theological anthropology and how like our bodies are raised at the end of time, like the people would miss the point. But say like just don't step on graves, like it's communicating something important. And those markers are in all sorts of places throughout our life. So you know, like we hear the rule about not eating flesh meat. We're like, well, that's arbitrary or just made up. But think about like our most important relationships. Like I wear a wedding ring everywhere I go. Each day I try to say to my wife, I love you. You know, on certain days like our anniversary and Valentine's Day, you're expected to give even like very certain kinds of gifts, like, plants that have been cut out from the ground or chocolates, right? And all these things, like you could give someone like a long excursus on the importance of marriage and treating this as the most important relationship in your life. But for a lot of dum-dums like me, we would sort of miss the point. But you have these markers, always say I love you, do these things on certain days, and all of a sudden, again, you've created this kind of like robust culture or soil out of which great relationships can grow.
Every Fat Tuesday, I do say I love you to meet before I go. Nice. Like I'm going to eat. Yeah, no. I'll say this too, but one of the, there's a minute left. I'm dumb. I'm gonna pull a you and sort of bring this up. You know, it's interesting that when people decided that all of these things were just shallow, rote things that had no meaning behind them, but guess what historical event I'm going to bring up when you first really hear these things thrown at old practices?
Printing press?
Absolutely. Like, so the Protestants start saying, oh, these are just senseless repetitions, precisely when the world starts to change in a revolutionary way, where we start to think things like arguments that can be permanently printed on a page and repeated are the most important thing. Again, I like to point out that when you do a repetitious prayer like the Hail Mary and you can't read, like you make that word, to say Mary's name over and over again in an illiterate society is a way to make her present, right? Then in a way that only statuary could maybe match that. By the way, they liked destroying statues when the revolution happened. I think that the more and more as we go into modernity, you see, right, that people go, these are just senseless repetition. We were just doing stuff. It didn't mean anything behind it. And you go, well, we destroyed old senses of meaning. So it might not have been the repetitions, bud. It might have been our change in understanding how knowledge worked. We might have blamed the wrong thing, my friend. And I think that gets back to this essential idea. The church wants to persuade you. It doesn't want to coerce you out of the gate. We can talk about infant baptism later, bud, because we do deal with that. But no matter what you're going to say is, okay, so you have to be persuaded, but the persuasion is to submit to a coercion. And it's precisely those markers that make us, like you said, not only remind us, bud, but sort of give us the courage to say, and one more time, this will I possess, I hand it over to the Lord. And I do that on Ash Wednesday. I do that in my practices of Lent. All of the things you said, they are little movements of the will to first grab it up and say, my will is mine, and then, but I give it away. And I think that that's hopefully what this season is telling us about. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, be that as it may, or however you may, that's what I was trying to say, listen to the show, whether that's on the airwaves of Iowa Catholic Radio throughout the state of Iowa and the various places that we both have long-established signals and are popping up all over the place, or iowacatholicradio.com, Iowa Catholic Radio app, or, of course, you all who listen on the podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I hope you had a... I was going to say Lent-tastic time, but I don't know if that's a real word or not.
That was like a Gaudete Sunday for me. A little break in the Lenten, grind. But
a little cheerfulness.
Yes, Lent is a great time to join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. The Rosary is broadcast on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. The Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app not only to keep up with, the Iowa Catholic Radio app. It's kind of a tongue twister.
Indeed.
Not only to keep up with events and goings on, but also to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
But Lent is Lent the Super Bowl, or is it the playoffs leading up to the Super Bowl of Easter? We got done with the Super Bowl. That's why I'm asking.
I think Easter's the Super Bowl.
Easter is the Super Bowl. Easter's not the Taylor Swift concert after. At any rate, I hope everyone got to enjoy the Super Bowl. I wasn't cheering for who won, but that doesn't matter, bud. What we're talking about is ways that you can prepare the playoffs, as it were, of Lent that lead up to the Super Bowl of Easter. That was my really bad, dumb lead up to this, but I'm going to go forth with it. If you go to iowacatholicradio.com and look at events, you can see other things you can do, both through Lent and then, of course, during the Easter season. February 18th and 19th in Madrid, 3 p.m. and 7 p.m., Hanson Hall at St. Malachi, Anthony Digman. February 26th in the Tea Room, Forge presents an evening with Ralph Martin. March 1st, West Des Moines, Iowa Catholic Radio. We're going to have a First Friday Mass. March 9th out in Cedar Rapids, both at St. Pius, the 10th Catholic Church. In Cedar Rapids, Archdiocese of Dubuque Men Conference, so check that all out as well. April 12th in Altoona, St. John and Paul, Peter Herbeck at St. John and Paul Church. And then finally, March 9th, that's going to be the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. Make sure to check all that out and consider if you're able to be a part of all of our goings about and doings here in the radio listening area. But of course, we're also coming up, like we said, in spring, obviously, if we're in Lent. Spring is just around the corner. So please prayerfully consider giving to iowacatholicradio.com. You can do that at iowacatholicradio.com, Iowa Catholic Radio app, or call 515-223-1150. Remember that this broadcasting is a ministry that is not just the people on air, behind the boards, or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. We can reach out to people and make sure they hear the word of Christ in the various times in their life. Radio's always waiting there for people to hear it, so please consider giving as we go into the almsgiving season of Lent. Bud, powerful, hopefully, indication about getting Lent started out right. I, like you said, feel like I'm more, is girded up, the right word, geared up to go with Lenten practice.
Yeah, we've said this on the show before, but please do know that we're praying for all of our listeners as you enter this Lenten journey. Pray that God will give you many spiritual blessings in the lead up to the joyous celebration of Easter.
So we're thankful for you guys to be a part of all that we do here. Thank you for making Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good one of the folks that you celebrate this ministry with. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one. and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.